I'm an urban planner by training, and you might be wondering why am I going to try and talk about economic models, and that is because we, as urban planners dealing a lot with community spaces in different cities, we're an international team. I myself am from Rome, been mainly working there and in Vienna, but some colleagues are working maybe in Budapest or Berlin, and this is what I will try to tell you a little bit about. The idea is that when dealing with these community-run spaces, then as we've heard a lot yesterday and this morning, one of the delicate points is always the access to the funding. Not only for just getting the money, just to make it very clearly, but also how do we organize the money in the community? Because as we know, together with the money comes also the power and the decision-making power related to this. So this is what I will try to tell you. Two stories, and hopefully this is going after lunch, going to wake you up a little bit, because you're going to have to do a bit of a translation effort, as I'm not going to talk about housing projects. I will be talking about projects that are related to other types of community-run spaces that have financial and organizational models that I hope will be of some inspiration. So hopefully in the discussion after you can get back to me and say, actually, it was completely irrelevant. We don't see any possibility of translating any of this. And also the additional translation effort will be also because we're talking about stories that are in a completely different context to what is here. And I think it's been very interesting also in some of the discussions both during yesterday and today, and also later this afternoon, we'll be then translating into the Irish and Dublin context. So what I would like to take you to is to Berlin and to Rotterdam. And I hope you are not totally familiar with these experiences, but maybe only a little bit, so hopefully this will be of some interest to you. So the reason why I'm telling you about this, and I can maybe circulate a copy of the book for those of you who would like to see it, is that as part of the questions that we were dealing with as part of our work, we published a book which is downloadable for free, so you're very welcome to go and download the PDF, which is collecting stories of different economic models for community-run spaces around Europe. Sadly, we don't have any stories from Ireland, so I really do hope that you will be anyway sending us stories from the community spaces that you are running or that you are engaged with. So I'd like to talk about two issues today. One is accessing capital, and the other one is related to that, how do we organize our communities, as these are very, very strictly related issues. So the first story I'd like to tell you about is about ExRotaprint in Berlin. So we're in Wedding. It's one of, at the time, one of the less fancy neighborhoods in Berlin. It's definitely going through a gentrification process now. It was an old printing house factory that was originally owned by the city council, who then sold it to a series of developers. And the issue was that the community that at the time was renting the spaces, which was artist spaces and spaces for social initiatives, for example, teaching German to migrants and so on, realized that all of a sudden they wouldn't be able to have the space anymore if this were to go completely in the market, because already in a lot of neighborhoods of the city of Berlin, they had seen how the private real estate market was being actually extremely aggressive, rising the prices. And I gather that this here in Dublin might sound kind of familiar to some extent. So we're talking about quite a big space. 10,000 square meters, and the point that is actually really, really interesting here, thank you very much, is the point was there is no profit to be made here, because all of a sudden they realized that as soon as the community was discussing about the possibility of becoming the owner, everybody started getting super excited about the idea that they could actually make a profit, because you could sell your shares and make a profit out of it, because the neighborhood is actually rising in price. So all of a sudden, the whole point that they were trying to make to safeguard themselves was actually becoming somehow a vicious circus, for which actually a lot of the people in the community were getting actually very excited of becoming part of that same process they were criticizing. So this is when they started realizing that there was an ethical stake that they had to take. And this is one of the basic points that we're making out of this story, that it's not only an issue about money, it's also an ethical issue and a political issue of how you want your community to be standing in the whole story of the urban development. Because what happened was that here you see the ExRotaprint. what they looked into was the possibility of getting in contact with an institution that you don't have here, we don't have in most European countries, so don't be sad about it, it happens. But there are some interesting insights that we can learn from, that are foundations that deal with the land. So what you see in the sketch made by the ExRotaprint community is that basically the deal that they managed to organize was to separate the land from the building. Now, according to the very different juridical context in which we might be moving, this can be to some extent also what community land trusts do. So in itself, the concept is not totally new. And what is interesting here is that basically they access the funding for the acquisition and also for the renovations that were very, very much needed on the building. So how these foundations, in particular Trias, that is a German foundation, and Edith Marion, which is a Swiss foundation, I'll very banalize it, and then we'll try to hopefully listen to a video interview, if everything works, directly from Trias Stiftung, which might be directly more interesting. The acquisition was €600,000. It was quite cheap because of a series of reasons that they managed to get it within a sort of package of real estate that was being sold to some Icelandic investor. But aside of the sort of details of the story, €600,000 was anyway a lot of money for the community that couldn't anyway afford that. But they could afford the rent, which was what anyway they had been paying. So what they realized is that what they wanted to do was to make sure that they would pay the rent at the same price that they always paid, because they knew that in perspective the prices would rise, and at that point in 5 years' time the basic rents that they used to pay would have been affordable. What happens is the Edith Marion and Trias Stiftung, what they do basically is they lend the money to the community. They become the owners of the piece of land, and the community is the owner of the building, but they pay somehow a rent, so to say, on the piece of land. So what happens is, I don't know, hopefully also there at the back you can kind of read the numbers, but anyway, if not, you can look them up in the book and in the articles for if you want to look into the numbers. But what they do is that basically 5% of the interest, which is actually quite high, especially on market price nowadays, is paid for 25 years to pay the loan back. But then, forever, they will nevertheless pay a 3%, basically, forever, which means that in this way, these foundations are able to have new income to reinvest on new spaces. So this is what I'm saying about the fact that it is an ethical stake. If they had managed to convince a regular commercial bank, which, as we know very often for communities, it's very difficult to do, they would have probably, anyway, it would have turned out to be cheaper for them. But this means that forever they will be paying this price. And this is what I was saying, an ethical standpoint. Obviously, this, if we want to also raise some critical issues, this nowadays means that the Trias Stiftung, for example, is owner of a lot of community spaces. This means that the foundation, being external to the community in itself, has somehow a bit of a power, because we can say that in 20, 30 years' time, the members of the community could change and could want to change also the mission of the space, and therefore, for example, speculate on the property. But this is where the fact that the land is owned by a different entity ensures the protection from speculation. The other side of this, that is a bit of a paradox, which I think is quite interesting, is because the city of Berlin is in the condition that over the last years they have been forced to sell their own property. Some of the departments, for example, culture or social affairs departments, against what the real estate department has to do, tries to get in contact with these foundations and says, please buy the properties. So now we're in the crazy situation in Berlin, for which, to some extent, the foundations that are private foundations, like Trias Stiftung, is actually buying off the property from the public and somehow safeguarding the public interest within a private foundation, which is, I think it is something that we also have to question at a certain issue. It is a bit of a peculiar setup, and I think there is nevertheless something to be pushed towards public institutions to be maybe inventing some of these models for themselves rather than having to externalize completely to others. But nevertheless, I think that this experience can be, to some extent, something that could be interesting here in the Dublin and Irish context, despite the fact that you might not already have a Trias Stiftung in itself. But the idea of the model is actually very simple. The other topic I'd like to talk about is the organizing of the communities. It's obviously fitting the topic of the session, anyway, dealing with the financial models, but looking very much into the model of organizing the community, because, as we said, this has to do with the way you organize your community and the way you manage the money is actually looking into the power distribution and who are you involving in setting up the power. There were some of the discussions, which is always an issue with the co-housing, for example. Who are we getting involved? Is it only middle class? Are we going to involve also people that are coming maybe for a more disadvantaged economic and educational background? And these are all issues that need to be openly addressed in order to understand where do we stand when we are working with community work. So I'd like to take you to Rotterdam. Any of you been to Rotterdam? Okay, so I don't know whether you have been to the south of Rotterdam, in Afrikaanderwijk, which is one of the neighborhoods exactly in the south, which is historically with people working from the port. So as Dublin, probably you can already imagine that obviously we're talking about an area which is not one of the wealthiest. It nowadays has a very, very strong percentage of migrant background. So in fact, we're talking about 85% is background with migrant background and a huge percentage of social housing. And a lot of these people are, how do you say it in British, on the dole, so they're on social security. So it means that there is, to some extent, some form of welfare support, but there isn't a real economy to allow for these people to actually get out of their condition. So in this story is where we see that the project was initiated by a group of artists that were working in this neighborhood. I know that there are some projects of co-housing related to also artist work also here in the city centre of Dublin, so I don't know if some of them are here. It could be interesting also to see how, in terms of social inclusion, they're thinking about their work and so on. Because in this case, the project was initiated by Janne van Heijswijk, which is a well-known not only in the Netherlands artist, which works very much with social projects. What they realize is the fact that if you want to be able to upscale and uprise the population of the neighborhood, you have to actually work with the creation of work. And I'll make this very, very simple now. Obviously, the story is longer and complex as it was developed over a number of years. But what they realized was that the possibility of creating a cooperative on a neighborhood scale. And this is quite interesting because the members of the cooperative are very diverse. The members of the cooperative are, to start with, local shops. I heard that in Ballymont there are some projects related to getting on board the local shopkeepers, as they recognize that there is a benefit in trying to improve the conditions of a neighborhood, because if you get more economy circulating, people will be able to spend more in shops will benefit. So obviously it's a virtuous cycle. So what happens is that they set up a cooperative model, taking on board the different hubs in the neighborhood, and the cooperative is not only responsible for delivering services to the member of the cooperative themselves, but is also initiating new sub-cooperative projects that are creating employment for the local inhabitants. And one of the issues that is relevant to keep in mind is that Rotterdam is a city that has a very important economic dimension, for example, because of its port. So, and a lot of businesses that are involved in the logistics and so on have their headquarters. So it's not that the city of Rotterdam in itself does not have economy flowing into the city, but the money does not flow into these neighborhoods. It flows into other neighborhoods and does not stay. But if we analyze the flow of the money, actually we do see that the money does go past Afrikaanderwijk, just it doesn't stay. So for example, we realize that a lot of these, for example, there is related to the social housing, there would be the cleaning, but this is not done from locals, this is done, for example, from big firms that have maybe the contract for the cleaning of all the social housing in the entire region. Or for example, a lot of the companies would have caterings and so on. So there is opportunities for creating also businesses that are also locking the money in the neighborhood and not just, but you have to create systems that will actually capture that value. So this, for example, is one of the cafes. Actually, if you do go there, very, very nice coffee. This is said by an Italian, so you can really rely on that. And this is one of, for example, one of the first cafes that adhered to the neighborhood cooperative, which the cooperative then has a basis, which is the headquarters, so to say, which were an old fire station that was then given by the city council to the cooperative for free. They only cover the utility costs, and they run a series of community activities and so on. And they have also a community kitchen, which is open to the neighborhood, but also to one of the sub-cooperatives of the project. So this is the model, and I think this is quite clear. They are together also, and it's interesting actually that also the previous project of the ExRotaprint was also co-initiated by a group of artists. There is definitely also clarity in the narrative of their initiatives, which I think can be quite of inspiration, because they actually analyze the processes very, very well and are able to tell the story. So what happens here is that the mother cooperative gets the fees from the local shops. 50% of the funding goes, here you should sort of see it, 50% goes to cover the services for the members of the cooperative. So basically services are run again for the shops so that they get directly a benefit for joining the cooperative. 25% is spent for running the costs of the cooperative. Obviously you have, just like an event here, imagine, even more upscaled, you have costs of people, materials, and activities being organized. And then 25% is reinvested towards setting up sub-cooperatives that are then dealing with activities in the neighborhood. And this, what is interesting, is that they set up 3 sub-cooperatives, one that is doing the cleaning in the social housing projects, one that is doing catering, and this allows for the possibility of capturing the money in the neighborhood. I'm not sure whether we have a couple of minutes for listening for the view.
You don't have a couple of minutes.
So at this point, what I would just to conclude would say is that there is, at this point, in both the story, we see that there is a big conflictual relationship or a missing actor that is the public administration. So these are completely self-initiated projects. And to pass on the word then also for Carles, that will be talking about Barcelona, I think one of the aspects that we also have to see is how some of these completely self-initiated projects can also benefit from the support of the public administration, not on a sort of subsidy model, but also on a supportive model, allowing for the communities to self-organize themselves. At this point, I would say thank you very much.